still a need for business travel? Today, we're asking, can we justify the environmental cost of travel after COVID?
And here to discuss this are journalist and travel expert Jill Starley-Grainger. And we hope to be joined by Sean Tipton, a spokesperson for the Travel Association ABTA.
Yeah, having a few technical issues there. Also joining us is Anna Hughes, the director of a campaign group Flight Free UK, and human rights lawyer and campaigner Harpreet Kaur Paul. Welcome to you all. We'll start with you, Jill. During lockdown, the UK's carbon emission fell. I mean, this is astonishing, by 13%. This is mostly due to cuts in flying and car use. Given where we are environmentally, should we just be stopping flying altogether?
I think there are real benefits to travel and traveling beyond your own country's borders internationally. There have been proven benefits from personal mental health to communities, to the world at large, creativity, problem solving, happiness. All these things can be benefited by traveling to other countries and to unusual destinations, maybe not even just your closest neighbor. So I don't think we should give up on travel altogether, but I do certainly think there is a question about how much we are flying.
Yeah, Anna, proven benefits, there are loads of them, and the travel industry is on its knees. It's not just big airlines, it's small businesses who rely on tourism. It's poor countries, and many people will say tourism, global tourism, helps the transfer of wealth from wealthy countries to poor countries. Isn't there a big human cost if we stop travelling?
I think, as Jill said, there are definitely advantages to travel and there are so many benefits. And we can still have those benefits even if we choose not to fly. So we're so lucky here with our proximity to many, many other countries of so many different cultures across Europe, which we can easily reach by train. Some of them take a little bit longer, but we can definitely reach our near neighbours and even our kind of middle near neighbours without having to fly. The question of tourism is quite a tricky one. There's not just one simple answer, but let's not forget that we as British tourists take more out of our own economy than other tourists bring in when they arrive. So we talk about, airport bosses will say, oh, it's really important that we have this airport for our own economy. Well, actually, we take the net result is that more money is taken out of our economy as a result of having those flights at our fingertips. And also on that, we must not forget the negative impacts of tourism as well. So there are many places across the world and within Europe who suffer from over-tourism. So this isn't even, talking about the global effect of climate change, which does affect everybody, especially those people in those poor countries. So it's not just as simple as saying we need to go to poor countries so they can benefit from our wealth, because actually the cost of us flying all over the world is climate change and everybody pays the cost. And currently it is those people living with the harshest effects, which tend to be in the poor countries.
Harpreet, the answer often seems to be that make things more expensive, greater taxation. But as we know, that's going to hit the less well-off holidaymakers the hardest. The wealthy are still going to be able to fly, aren't they, no matter how expensive it gets. So doesn't that have an issue about equal right to travel?
I think you've hit on a really important point there, and equity really has to be at the centre of whatever our solutions are to climate change. We're in a context where something like 10% of the wealthiest are contributing towards something like 75% of emissions linked to flying. So the idea that just having a slight additional taxation that they don't worry about, that they can still pay, as you suggested, and still travel isn't really going to address that injustice, that those that are able to charter a helicopter or a private jet, whether it's to Cornwall or the Caribbean, are disproportionately contributing to our current context that's driving impacts among those communities that are least responsible. So I think there's also something to be said for regulation coming in here around how much travel is done, the type of travel that's taking place, and also thinking about kind of banning advertising to kind of give this view that you can get the same benefits of traveling by having to travel by air, which is having such disastrous impacts on communities. We're living through those at the moment. You can just see the impacts currently in Canada, And as has been said earlier, they're far more severe in the global south, where communities are struggling to survive and not at all contributing in the same way to our global climate crisis.
Sean from ABTA's joined us. Good to have you with us. We've been talking, as you know, about reducing travel. I want to ask you this question that I asked Jill earlier. Carbon emissions have dropped by 13% during the pandemic, and that's because of reduced flights and reduced car use. I mean, this feels like a great moment to capitalise on that, to save the planet, doesn't it? And stop flying.
I think you can, obviously, nobody's going to deny that flying contributes towards carbon emissions. Of course it does. But I think the other side to this is if you look at the impact on the pandemic on the environment, it's had a pretty disastrous impact as well. I saw some fairly shocking figures from people working around in wildlife conservation around the planet. And the number of rangers and people working in parks have been reduced substantially because of the fact they weren't getting any tourism revenue in. Also, if you look at the impact on some of the poorest countries in the world, they're very heavily reliant on tourism. And because of the fact, I mean, one particular Caribbean island told me a few years ago when I was talking to their tourism minister that 70% of the people on his islands were reliant on travel and tourism for jobs. So by taking those jobs away, you actually have a much less incentive if you're living in a country whereby those jobs have gone to protect the environment yourself. So I think that's the other side to this. And the pandemic has been devastating on many very, very poor countries economically, and I've said, and that has a very direct impact on the environment in those countries as well.
Now, as we're demonstrating right now, we don't necessarily need to meet face-to-face anymore to have conversations and discussions. So surely, Sean, this is an end to business travel as we know it.
Well, I think it's going to reduce. That's undeniable. I mean, if you look at people in the sector saying they think it is going to go down once we start being able to travel once more. But having said that, the business community itself has been very vocal about the need to start meeting up again. But in many countries, it's very difficult to seal a deal if you don't do it face-to-face. It really is. The actual number of people travelling for business travel is actually fairly small. The majority will be going for leisure trips. But we're dealing with a situation now where the economy is in a very difficult position. But just by saying you're not going to be able to meet people for business purposes is actually going to be pretty damaging to our economy. So there's a whole range of issues. So I don't think anybody in the travel industry would deny it. And we're very conscious of our impact on the environment, but in fact more so than most, because there's a lot of very impassioned people who started off, let's say, as reps or just backpacking around the world, saw what a beautiful place we live in and wanted to get involved, and also working ways to conserve that environment. And I know that there are so many initiatives going on now which started probably 20 or 30 years ago, which are actively helping local people. And I think that's one big side to all of this. It's about helping local people to help themselves and make sure that they see travel and tourism as a benefit to them economically, which means they'll have much more impetus to look after the environment they live in. And that's definitely something we're seeing. But of course, moving forward, we do need to move away from fossil fuels, and that is happening. Yeah. And obviously, the sooner the better, really. But in the short term, if we stop travelling, as we have done during the pandemic, the damage is absolutely catastrophic, and that's actually very damaging for the environment as well.
Anna, you're shaking your head there. Do you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are always two sides to this. And I would say the catastrophic damage is going to come from the climate crisis. And people are already dying. In that context, it's fairly inappropriate to be continuing to burn fossil fuels at the rate we are, just so we can go on holiday. There are many people in the Caribbean who would also say, please stop flying here. Our islands are sinking. Yes, it's a beautiful place to come to, and it's an amazing holiday destination. And of course, yes, we do take money into those poorer island nations, but the ultimate impact is already happening. And, we should love the Caribbean enough to preserve it for future generations.
OK, Jill, we touched on this earlier with Harpreet about whether holidaying is just for the wealthy if we continue the way we're going, putting up prices. So I saw, actually, earlier in the week, that a holiday in Cleethorpes Caravan Park, they're charging £4,000 a week for 1 week in August for a week in a caravan. I mean, it's lovely to spend time in a caravan, but £4,000. And if we put the prices up of flights and cheap holidays, effectively what we're saying is you can only go on holiday if you're wealthy. If you haven't got much money, you need to stay at home. It feels like that, doesn't it?
Yeah, and And that's absolutely right. Holidaying in the UK is very expensive, and it has been for a long time. There are just too many people trying to go to too few places in the UK. We're a small country. So it does seem that it would be unfair to just say everything's going to be expensive, which is why, personally, I'm a fan of the frequent flyer tax, which is the more you travel, the more you're going to pay. And this would also get rid of a lot of the unnecessary business travel. I agree with Sean, there's certain business travel that will still have to happen. And you have to bear in mind that a lot of the world is not as well connected to the internet as we are. So if you're doing business in countries, particularly in any developing countries that don't have great infrastructure, the only way you can really do business is by flying there. And it's not that easy to take a train to parts of Africa or Asia from the UK. So there will still need to be some, but holidaying in the UK is completely unaffordable for many people. If they could get a train to France or Spain or other countries, and that train was subsidized while the flying was taxed higher, then perhaps this would help with the problem, because I agree something needs to be done. We're flying too much. Trains are too expensive, and they really need to come down in price to make those train trips much more affordable for everybody. So it's not just for rich people.
Anna, my once-a-year flight to Corfu or the Greek islands isn't going to make that much difference, is it, as one person? How much can those individual choices really have an effect on environmental change?
Well, yeah, even that one flight puts us in a category of kind of privileged frequent flyers in global terms. So most people across the globe have never been on a plane and don't fly at all. One flight a year sounds like a small number, but when you add it up with all the people in the UK who do take one flight a year, our tourism sector, which accounts for 65% of flights, so those are purely for holidays, that doesn't include visiting family and friends, and actually business flights are very low, only 10%. So yes, if business travel drops as a result of the pandemic, that will be good. But overall, it will have a small impact because it's not a high percentage of the overall sector. But yeah, it's we collectively can have an impact. Of course, there are millions of people in the UK who take that one flight a year. If they chose to travel by other means instead, that would be millions of flights that would not take off.
Yeah. Harpreet, there's an effort to place crimes against the environment, to call it ecocide, on the same level as genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity and acts of aggression in the International Criminal Court. Is it comparable to those?
I think what we're going to see over the next year is increasing evidence of the scale of climate impacts that we're already seeing. And together, the global community has committed to limiting global temperature to between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And even at those temperatures, we're going to see escalating and accelerating climate change impacts. We've already seen in 2013 one super typhoon, Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, caused 4 million people to be displaced, cause immense property damage, cause loss of life of over 7,000 people. And if one typhoon can cause $10 billion in damage, and we've seen more and more of those occur and more scientific evidencing each storm, each flood, each wildfire, each escalating year of temperature that we're seeing can be linked to climate change, what we're going to be looking at very soon is something like $300 billion of loss and damage just in the global south linked to climate change. And that number really can't give voice to the individual stories. Yeah. We've heard young children describe the harrowing stories of not knowing if their fathers are going to come back fishing after a storm has hit the coast of Mozambique, for example. So when you start digging into the stories and think about how they relate to these immense numbers of the loss and the fact that air pollution, fossil fuel related deaths are already very high, I think we can quickly see how these things are comparable.
Yeah, okay. And I think the one thing we can all agree on is this debate will continue for many years to come. Really good to talk to you all. Thank you very much indeed.
Now, we've got some viewer comments coming in about this topic.